It's Wednesday, the 11th of September. I'm Adam Walsh, and this is The Signal. Today on the show, the autumn issue of Newfoundland Quarterly, coastal steamers, fishing fleets, shipwrecks, and their lasting imprints on history and culture. Join us as we take a deep dive to explore the pages of the latest issue. Yeah, I always know the season is changing when it comes time to do another episode about the Newfoundland Quarterly, right? So if you've listened to one of these previous shows, you'll kind of know what to expect. We chat about the issue with the folks who contribute, some of the folks who contributed to it. We talk about the themes. And it's like a DVD bonus feature, especially if you get a subscription to this thing, right? Because you get to hear some of the behind-the-scenes chats around it. So as always, Joan Sullivan, managing editor of Newfoundland Quarterly, is here. How you doing?
Liner notes, like special.
There you go, liner notes, right? And yeah, if there's young people listening, they're like, "What do you mean DVDs?" But I think I'm fine with that one. Tell me more about the theme before we get into the other guests who are here sat around the table.
The theme is ships, vessels, sailing, trade, transatlantic trade. We stole our text, our cover text, swift sails, fearful wrecks from Shakespeare, of course, to
good
tie
person to steal from.
Yeah, actually, yes, and the best only, and so that ties together the pieces that go right down to the ocean floor, as far away as the Antarctic, and up the coast to Labrador.
And why for this issue? What was the thought process behind it?
Just how things come together. You know, there's just so many ideas all the time, and always with this issue, I find somebody mentions an idea, then someone like one of our guests, say, Dr. Latonia Hardery, who of course does, like, she's like a Swiss Army knife. She can do just about everything.
That is such a good description.
Yeah, and then, you know, she happens to mention an idea to me, and then something else happens, and then there you go. There you got a magazine.
Right on. As it was kind of sailing forward with the idea here, and it started to come together, what were you thinking, like, when you started to see the pieces that you had, and you're like, this is, because it is, I mean, I say this every time, but it is such a good issue.
It just comes together really well. I think one thing I really would love to mention is we thought, okay, we're talking about ships, we have to do something on the Lubov Orlova, and so Andrew Hawthorne, who of course you know, colleague of yours, who's also a graphic artist, comic artist, has a 2-page spread on the history of that incredible ship and its dreadful fate.
Remind people of the Orlova if they can't remember.
It was docked in St. John's Harbor for 3 years.
Yeah, a while.
Completely abandoned. There was some attempt to tow it out to sea. And more misadventure followed. I won't give away the end of that story, but it also turned out it was named for a very famous Russian actress, a favorite of Stalin's, and had begun life as a luxury cruise ship. So, and I find there's something, I think we talked a little bit about this too with Neil Burgess, we will be chatting with later, but we personify, or we put a lot of personality into ships. Vessels mean a lot to us. There's, they're not just wood, you know, or steel. There's something about where they've been, what they embody, or people, you know, the people really, you know, as you often even find people refers to ships as she, you know.
Yeah. There's a lot. I had a tour of the Orlova when, as it was still alongside, actually.
Oh, really?
Back when I was a reporter. Yeah. It was one of those ones. Like sometimes when you're a reporter, you just you're walking by and you're like, knock, knock. Hey, can I? And then like the owner or the person, like the manager at the time, was like, sure. And so I did this like tour, and it was all empty and old, and I was kind of like, oh, this is really neat. Then afterwards there was a whole fuss because I don't think he was allowed to let me in, and I was a CBC reporter, but like just to be even to know and have like a little bit of a connection to like that ship history is kind of neat. When you're a reporter, you get to go to neat places sometimes.
Yes. More than sometimes, I would imagine.
Yeah, a lot. More of a house cat these days, but it's great. So now people bring their stories in to me. Who else do we have here today?
We've mentioned
Yeah.
Tony Hardery. Maybe she would like to introduce the
Yes,
woman that's next
you've
to
brought
her.
someone who's rather important
Yeah.
today.
A
So let's
surprise,
I'll let you
surprise.
do a good intro here.
Yes. Yes, well, to my right here today is Frances Rooney, who is a writer and a researcher. I would like to say another Swiss Army knife, if I may. And Frances wrote the books Working Light, The Wandering Life of Edith S. Watson, and Working the Rock, Newfoundland and Labrador, and the Photographs of Edith S. Watson from 1890 to 1930. And Edith Watson was a young photographer who came to Newfoundland and Labrador to take photos of our lifeways, as I said, starting in the 1890s. And of course, she would have gotten here on ships and ferries. And Frances can certainly speak to her modes of transport. And that's how I've come to know Frances. 5 years ago, I picked up one of her books at a time of grief in my family's life. And what she wrote about Edith S. Watson and Edith's life truly inspired me. And I reached out to her, and she's here with us today.
Thanks for coming in. I appreciate this.
Thanks for having me.
Do you want to tell us a little bit more about Edith then?
Oh, Edith. Dear
You're like, how long do you have, Adam?
Speaking of Swiss Army knives, seems to be a gathering of them. Edith was a Victorian woman. She was born in 1861 in Connecticut, and she never had any of the proper Victorian lady need to be private and quiet and obedient and all those other things. She knew from very early on that she was going to need to make her own living, and she had wanderlust. So when she finished high school at 19, she and her sister wandered New York and Pennsylvania and Connecticut and Massachusetts with their paintings. They were watercolor painters at that point. And they would pack 100 paintings and put them on the bus and take the tip of the bus to the train and take the train to the next town and unpack the boxes and put them up in the gallery. And when the show was done, they would take those paintings down. Does this sound familiar to anybody? And pack them up again and put them in a bus to take to the train, and it went on and on and on. They did that for 10 years. At the end of that time, for reasons unknown, her sister, Amelia, who was a much better painter than Edith was. Edith could make a living at it, but it wasn't her passion. So Amelia started going south, mostly to North Carolina, where she connected with artists' colonies and all kinds of people and markets. And Edith, for some reason, went north. She had been as far as North Sydney before, but this time she got on a ferry. And an overnight ferry to Port aux Basques. And then I can just see her standing on the dock. No, okay, now where do I go? And from there she managed to wander the coast, mostly. She found places to stay. She boarded with people in their homes. She traveled by fishing boat or other boat. When there was a road, she took that. When there was nothing else, she walked. And she went all around the island and up Labrador. And she did this repeatedly for a period of 40 years. So
40 years.
40 years.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's a bit of time.
Yeah. And she, as I said, she made her living. She had to. And she, soon into her times of coming, there was a notice outside Twillingate that said that Miss Edith Watson, the watercolor painter, was coming again this year, and she'd brought her camera. So that's when that part of it started in earnest. She had learned to paint, to use a camera, probably from her uncle who taught at Harvard, taught botany mostly, but also occasionally photography. And this was an adored uncle, so it was a very pleasant process for her. And she started photographing the people in the places she went, doing the things they did. So she wound up with an incredible body of work of rural people working, women, children, men, and doing real things in real settings, mostly outside, carrying water on hoops, which was, of course, a revelation to the rest of the world, and repairing nets, drying fish, women on the flakes, people carrying fish to the stages, and observing people in their setting. And she did have to support herself, so she made herself a market in all of this. She sold photographs of ships with their rigging to the companies that made the ropes that constituted the rigging. She sold to barrel exporters photographs of people making barrels. Newspapers, magazines, across Canada and down the mostly the east coast of the States, published thousands of her photographs by the time she was done. The Newfoundland government hired her for a travel brochure. She also did one for the Nova Scotia government. She bartered her photographs for places to stay, for transportation. So this was the ships and the CPR and the Cunard Line, which probably took her first to Bermuda, which is another story. And in Romantic Canada, the book she did with her partner in 1922, Victoria Hayward talks about crossing the strait, I'm not sure which one, in a storm, and being told at 2 o'clock in the morning by the people sitting on the pier, you really ought not to go there this time. Take a pass, wait for the weather to clear. And they didn't, and it made for a good story. So they made it. And
yeah. Well, how hard was it? Because like when you hear about someone who had thousands of pictures out there into the world, but this is a different time and different place. It's not with the internet or anything else. For someone like yourself, how hard was it to track certain things down about Edith and her work?
for me, I started with a photocopy of one of her photographs that a friend had made, and she showed it to me, and she said, "Why don't you see if you can find more of her stuff?" Mm. And I looked at it, and I was hooked.
Yeah.
It's on the cover of Working Light, and it took hundreds of letters and phone calls and interviews and 3.5 years to get an address.
Wow.
And then I tried to contact the people in Connecticut and sent one letter, got a reply, sent 3 more, got no replies to any of them, and finally did. And the Edith's cousin had died right after the first letter, and his wife, Lois Watson, who is responsible for keeping all this material and not letting it just rot, finally responded after about a year. Hmm. And I went there, and we looked into all this stuff. And interestingly, in the 1890s, Canada was not as unfamiliar as it became to later generations because of the literary magazines that existed and were very popular in the U.S. and particularly in New England, where she was from. How she actually decided to come to Newfoundland is anybody's guess. I just don't know. But the travel wasn't all that difficult. It wasn't, we'd complain if it took us 4 hours to get somewhere. But she could get from where she lived to Twillingate in 5 or 6 days. Not a lot. So she would start with the bus, and then a train, and then another train, and at least one more train, we're not sure, and then the ferry, and then the fishing boats and the smaller boats and the bigger boats and a cart if it was available and there was a road to ride it on, and sometimes on foot, and there you go. And she did this for years and years and years.
I'm feeling bad about complaining about cell phone connectivity when we went to Twillingate there this summer because the length of this journey, and meanwhile, John Blake's driving the car. I'm like, I can't get any service. This is horrible. Yes,
Yeah.
I need to practice some.
It's different.
some more patience. Latonia, there was something last night. Can you tell us what it was and what you were both at?
Yes. So Frances and I have been collaborating now for the last 5 years. As I mentioned before,
Yeah.
I had picked up one of her books, and that inspired me to reach out to her. And that's what I write about in the quarterly. So for the last 5 years, we've been corresponding and working together. And it's the Year of the Arts. So we thought, how do we celebrate Edith in this Year of the Arts?
Yeah.
It was hard to imagine the Year of the Arts passing by and not having Edith S. Watson's name out there. So we've been working on an exhibit for the last year, and is opening today. It's at the Annex in Mount Pearl, 365 Old Bristlinter Road, I think is the address. And so last night we just had a private, small, intimate gathering for anybody who worked on the exhibit, the graphic designers, people who helped with the installation. And there was just about 30 or 40 of us last night, and the electricity in the room was tangible.
Yeah.
Because so many, especially some of the young people that were there, had never seen those photos ever in their lives. And to see, when you look at those pictures, you're looking into the faces of the people that came before. Everything in those faces tell you, like I said in the article and last night too, the sorrows and joys that kind of built the place, in a way that shaped the culture. It's all there in the faces. So some people shed a few tears even because they just hadn't seen anything like that before. And knowing that it was generated by a young woman who took all these different modes of transportation to get here, but also to appreciate what she was seeing enough that she got the message out in a way about the place. Like one of the things that we did last night for the public, it's also free admission, is we got the cover of a magazine from Canadian Courier, September 1917, is a woman from Buren with a giant bundle of sticks on her back, as big as she is. And we blew it up sort of like a canvas and framed it. And there's a real emotion to it, because Edith had worked in National Geographic, Vogue, the New York Times.
Some slightly notable publications that you might
just a
know.
little
Yeah.
bit of a writing of a thing, yes. And I always, now that I've been learning Edith's story and being mentored by Frances in that regard, it's like, do Newfoundlanders out there know that our lives have been in National Geographic that early, that people representing the way we live were on these covers of magazines, and people found this fascinating, and Edith S. Watson captured it in a way that feels raw and real. Like as a Newfoundlander, when I look at the photos, I don't think, yes, in some of them people are posing, but it does feel natural. It feels like Edith met the people where they were, and
Yeah, they were doing something, and she was like, "Hey, can I take your picture?" And then you see, like your description of someone, their face, what they're doing. You think of the time, the place, who was before her or him or the kids in these pictures, what the time was like, and then the years following and their descendants, and if they're still around today. I mean, there's so much to think about when it comes to this, and the imprint it would have on us now.
yes, exactly. And then Francis and I, we've been doing some recording of interviews and things between us as well, because we have other projects coming up. We also talked about the relationship with the people, the trust, because people trusted Edith enough, especially the women, right? Because there's a massive, massive representation of women in this collection that you rarely see elsewhere. And those women trusted Edith to take their photos. But also I think the generosity of Newfoundlanders is something also to speak about here, because Edith sometimes showed up to these places as a stranger, and whether she paid for her room or board or not, people had to be open to taking her in. So in some ways, when we think about the mechanism, hate to use that word as we're talking about art, but like, you know, the system in which those photos emerged and the masterpieces that came to life, I think that the way our people can be hospitable and generous has, you know, a part to play in the conversation about how these photos came to life, in addition to Edith's talents and wherewithal to be so adventurous.
And taking photos back then, it wasn't like you're just whipping out a smartphone and taking a bunch of
gosh.
selfies, right? Like there's a
No.
bit more of a process to it back then, and then you got to talk people into it, and then they may not have even really seen that. Like depending on the time of the year and where you were, you're not seeing a whole lot of cameras kicking around all the time. So like even that process experience would have been a bit different too, right?
Yeah. And a lot of the photos were, well, Edith took photos all over Newfoundland and Labrador, but certainly a healthy portion of them are taken down where I'm from, which is the South Coast. So, you know, Hermitage, Harbour Breton,
Wow.
Bayes Bear. And I'm just trying to get my mind around, like, what does it look like now with Edith Watson coming up over the pier with her gear and her red carpet bag, and, you know, the ladies are out hanging the clothes or whatever, and they're like, what on earth is
A lot
going
of whispers around town around that one, you know. That's amazing.
Like, what does it look like? And young, right, Francis? Like, she was just 30 years old when she started coming here. So this young American woman out with her gear just popping up over the harbor in Hermitage up the, you know, I'm like, what? It must have been like an alien. But at the same time, I don't know. I want to qualify that by saying, like, I don't want to make it sound like our ancestors weren't people that weren't of the world, because back in the day, when we think about water and we live on an island, our brains can go to we're an isolated outport, but
The world will
water
come to
is a
us.
highway,
Yeah.
right? Back then, it's just so much expertise around boats, and same thing between Europe and here. Like, the water is freedom, and it is a highway. So, I mean, you know, people in the 1890s in Hermitage would have seen a lot of fishing boats and, you know, anything related to mercantile issues, but would they have seen a young American woman coming with gear? I don't think so.
Yeah, not an
Well,
everyday thing.
No.
Like, you know.
No.
So
This is one bit of what's in the latest Newfoundland Quarterly, right? And we're talking about travel. The other thing I think about when I think about Newfoundland and Labrador and all the water that surrounds us, shipwrecks. Neil Burgess, you want to tell me about yourself and what is in NQ right now for this latest issue?
Well, I'm involved in the Shipwreck Preservation Society of Newfoundland and Labrador. Excuse me. And I was lucky enough that Joan came and interviewed me and a colleague of mine, Chris Power, who's just published an amazing photo book on the shipwrecks.
World War II shipwrecks,
Yeah.
Boulder Books.
Oh, amazing book. So I got to share my passion for shipwrecks with Joan, and she did a great job of editing my rambling into a coherent article along with Chris's input. And I was amazed at how nicely it got across. The depth of the stories that are attached to the shipwrecks around our province and how many shipwrecks there are. And I mean, it goes from the 1500s right up till last week. I mean, there's wrecks happening all the time.
What's the number? Is it 10,000 is the estimate?
That's the mythology.
That's the
Sure.
mythology, and you feel it's more right than wrong.
Yep, I would say that. I mean, there's a great map in the Munn Library collection
Yeah.
from 1903, I think, and it covers basically the second half of the 1800s, and there's 700 shipwrecks just from that period. Wow. So if you go back another few hundred years and come forward through 2 world wars and all the rest, I mean, there's thousands of shipwrecks for sure.
Can you tell me about the shoe?
Oh, yeah, that was my moment, right?
Yeah.
So I got into diving with my wife back in 2011. And of course, one of the main diving attractions here for scuba diving is the 4 Bell Island shipwrecks. Yeah. And we go out all the time with Ocean Quest to dive on those shipwrecks. And at first, they were huge metal objects on the bottom of the ocean that were covered in this beautiful marine growth. I mean, they're like gardens. So there was the part of your mind that thinks about the history and the tragedy of those sinkings, U-boats actually torpedoing them.
Yeah, war was here. Right?
Yeah, sending them to the bottom, 65 guys dying and all that. And then there was the beauty of experiencing them as a scuba diver and exploring them and seeing all the incredible colors of the marine life. And then I was swimming on the PLM 27 and I came across a shoe in one of the bathrooms with a head. And it just stopped me cold because I couldn't help but think, was one of the sailors wearing this shoe when the ship went down? And that got me really thinking about the human side of the shipwrecks, not physical objects. And I started doing a lot of research on those Bell Island shipwrecks, and it kind of got me hooked. And I've been obsessed with it ever since.
What do you think research and looking for the human story in these wrecks, what does it give us? What are we keeping?
I think it connects us with the personal stories of the people who were involved. And that could be people that were on the shipwrecks. That could be families that had losses of their loved ones. It can be people on the coast of the province that were involved in rescues and rescue attempts at the risk of their lives, right? And those stories are tragic and heroic, and they connect because there's still living family members around that have had the stories passed down to them from grandparents and that, and it's very real for them.
You are listening to The Signal. I'm Adam Walsh. Today it's our quarterly show about the Newfoundland Quarterly. It's the autumn issue. And like I said at the beginning of the show, it's everything from coastal steamers, fishing fleet shipwrecks, lasting imprints on history and culture. We're taking a deep dive into the exploration of the pages of the latest issue. Joining me here in the studio, Joan Sullivan, managing editor of Newfoundland Quarterly, Latonia Hartery, filmmaker, Arctic expeditioner, archaeologist, Francis Rooney, researcher and writer, and Neil Burgess, president of the Shipwreck Preservation Society of Newfoundland and Labrador. I find when it comes to Newfoundland and Labrador, I will always hear the comment of we're so connected to the ocean and the waters around us. And it sounds so simple, right? But then you have something like this today where we talk about this issue and we talk about the stories and what's in it. There are so many complexities to that simple statement. There's also the thought of loss of what we have not found, what we haven't unearthed, shipwrecks yet to be found, photographs that could have been lost forever. Do you ever think about the loss of what we've either lost forever or what's left to be found and how important that can be when you do your work?
I find Neil brings such great context to it because, when you started by talking about you had a nice introduction to this too. The sea was the highway, right? So the ships were the buses, they were the trucks, they were the plane. Like everything came by sea, and there's any object carries a whole story of where it came, why it's here, why is it valuable, and all that kind of stuff. But it's funny too because I can't remember what you were talking about, but I remember we were just having our interview in Jumping Bean on Elizabeth Avenue, and then we were both tearing up, because of course it's quite emotional.
Yeah.
A shipwreck is dramatic. It's a chain of events. It involves a lot of people. It involves probably a lot of life. It probably involves a lot of heroics. There's just so, and all those stories are just such great stories. And then like the ship that they uncovered on the south coast from that
Yes.
storm.
Yeah.
And and everybody's very curious about it. Everybody wants to know, what's the mystery. And you were talking about how many interviews you were doing with people from all over the world.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
BBC and the New York Times and Agence France Presse. It must have been, like I was joking with one of the American journalists.
Yeah.
It's a slow news week. Donald Trump hasn't done anything
Hasn't
crazy.
said anything yet today.
Yeah.
Way today, but
But I mean, it is. It's a mystery that pretty much everybody can relate to.
Yeah.
And have an interest in. And that shipwreck is a complete mystery. We don't know where it came from. We don't know who was on it. We don't know where it was going. We don't know if people were lost when it was wrecked at Cape Ray.
Has it changed you for when you're on the water, right? So from going down and looking, I've got experience on the water, not under the water. And I'm just kind of wondering what that did with you from that first shoe to other dives around wrecks.
It's been really interesting looking at the distribution of shipwrecks around the province.
Yeah.
So when I'm out, I've got a boat last year, and I'm out all the time now. But when you see shoals along the coast, my mind immediately goes, I wonder what shipwreck is down around that. Who came to grief in the fog or in a storm on those shoals? And so much of our coast is lethal with rocks and shoals and stuff. It's dangerous stuff. So it's no surprise that there are so many shipwrecks. But it's every time I look around the coast, I go, I wonder.
Yeah.
I wonder what's down there.
And what the stories are.
And now you're not allowed to remove anything from a wreck. That's
No.
the law here,
So
right?
the shipwrecks are archaeological sites. So as soon as we find new ones, we send the coordinates into the Provincial Archaeology Office. They put it on their official database, and it becomes a protected site under provincial legislation. So you're not allowed to remove anything for souvenirs or your basement museum display or whatever. It all belongs to the province.
The other bit I was thinking of too, because we talked, like I was asking about what has yet to be found and what can be lost. They're not forever, even though stuff's been found from like the 1500s, right? But like things have changed from if you have folks diving in the 90s or early 2000s and now checking out some of these wrecks, there's less of them.
Yeah,
Right?
and I can give you a great example. Labor Day weekend, my wife and I were down at Isle of Mort, and I wanted to check. There's a very famous wreck down there, the astrolabe wreck. A local diver found 2 marine astrolabes back in the 1980s, the Musrow astrolabes. And that wreck was only excavated a little tiny bit in the 1980s. We don't really know a lot about it, except that it's European and it might be Basque, and it's from the middle 1600s because the 2 astrolabes had dates on them.
Yeah, and tell folks what an astrolabe is, because I had to look that up this morning.
Oh, it's like a sextant. So sailors used to use it to take a noontime angle on the sun, and from that they could calculate their latitude. So they used it for navigation. And it was the supercomputer of the day. They were extremely valuable. Most ships carried 2 of them in case one broke. And it was their only way of determining where they were.
And you're just getting latitude, right?
Yeah, and you're just getting latitude, right?
Wild.
And that's why ships coming from Europe used to go straight west
Yeah.
to where they were going. They would sail down the European coast to the latitude of their destination, and then they would basically catch the wind, if they could, and sail west. But that shipwreck is exposed to the south, and I was quite concerned that Hurricane Fiona a couple of years ago may have done a lot of damage. It could have completely blown it out.
Yeah.
So my wife and I went back and we had a look at it, and luckily it's in exactly the same condition as it was back in the 1980s.
Yeah.
What we saw matched right up with the shipwreck map that the archaeologists back in the 80s had drawn. So we were really lucky, and it's because there's some barrier islands that protect it from the swells.
Are there any chances of us figuring out exactly what country that ship may have come from?
I would love to see a project do more excavation on that wreck, because the wreck is big. It's probably 80 feet long, And back in the 80s, they only excavated 4 square meters at the bow. So less than 1% of the shipwreck has been excavated. They got about 300 artifacts. It was just a teaser of what's there. And they didn't get into the back of the ship where the really good stuff would be in the officers' quarters.
Right.
So that would be there's almost no shipwrecks in Atlantic Canada from the 1600s. So that would fill in a big gap. And if it's Basque, it might give us some real insights into what kind of trade and economy they were involved in back in those days, because the Basques were real leaders in exploring Atlantic Canada and harvesting resources here.
Wow. So what both of you, what do you think about, just again, that question of what's left to be discovered and the pictures that may still be out there or whatever for telling stories and the work that you've both done? Latonia?
Yeah. One of the things when I think about, just to bring it back to Edith for a second, is I think in my career I've tried, and I've done, or at least I hope I have to the best of my ability, is to use the skills that I have and try to look at Newfoundland and Labrador and the history and the culture of it and what shapes it and forms it, and push myself to look at it from new perspectives. And I'm at it all the time. Like, I'm passionate about it. I'm dedicated to it. So up early in the morning, even before work, I'm reading something about Newfoundland and Labrador, the Arctic, like just constantly at it to try to be as good as I can at my profession. But still, within all of that, all that research, all that commitment, I knew nothing about Edith S. Watson. Zero.
That's kind of wild, right? Like
It's
when this is what your breakfast is, right?
This
Your
is
breakfast,
what-
lunch,
yes.
and dinner, and
Yes.
you're sleeping it. You wake up, and then you'd be like, didn't know about this person.
Did not know anything about it. Now, the more research I've done, I've also realized that there's a couple of factors, as Francis has been talking about as well. But women have been left out of the founding narratives of photography, so there's the whole systemic and social thing around it. That really helps that story along. But that's why it's so incredibly important, I think, what Frances has done for Newfoundland and Labrador and Canada as well, when she wrote these books about Edith, and especially focusing on the Newfoundland material, because otherwise we never would have known these things. I don't know, maybe somewhere, somehow it could have, but I don't think so. It takes dedicated people to bring something like that, to life. I did want to say just one little quick thing that's mildly off topic, but I mean, it's still
hey, this is the place for it. Trust me, go for it.
well, it's more about these lost and recovered things. When Neil talked about the shoe, I was above the wreck of the Airbus when they. I didn't work on it, but when they were the year after they first located it, I was in the Parks Canada floating barge above where they were bringing up the artifacts, and one of the things was a shoe, and I don't know why, because I saw all the other artifacts as well, but that just one human shoe, it just brought tears to my eyes, because of course the story of the HMS Airbus and Terror is a whole other level of human suffering that is beyond the scope of the show today probably, but there was something about a shoe when I saw it that made my heart just...
Well, you're wearing shoes now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's just
what's
like...
more human than a shoe?
It's yes, it was something that was so human about the shoe, whereas other parts were like ship parts.
It's an intimate, like it's not a spoon, right? Like
No.
or a plate. It is something that was on a person's body, and then to think of like especially if you're talking like the hands of Franklin and like the loss and everything, and then all of a sudden you're like topics that songs have been sung about for a long time, and mysteries, and then to see not just to be there for the discovery, the real human part of it. Oh my gosh.
Yeah. And that's the thing, right? It is the human element. Like even now speaking about Edith S. Watson, we're talking about it historically, like it's of another time, but it's real human investment and labor that has brought these pictures to us. So same thing with those shoes, when we think about the Airbus and all of the people that died, and so many of those young sailors, they thought they were going out to do everything for king and country, quote unquote. and that ended up in true suffering. And there's like even little logs and notes, letters from mothers to those young sons that went on that ship. And the mothers, my one hope is that I will just see you again.
Right.
Right. The little letters the mothers gave to the sons. And of course, they never saw them again. So yeah, there's something, shoes, certainly something when it comes to ships and sailing and recovery of information. But back to the topic, of course, at hand for us and Edith coming here. Frances is also, as part of the exhibit, she's giving a talk Friday night, and she's going to talk all about Edith and how she got here and her work and her discoveries. So.
Where's the talk?
It's at the annex.
Okay.
Which
obviously makes sense, yeah.
Yes, yeah. And I saw that for the first time yesterday, and it's a wonderful space, and there's an exhibit of photographs around the walls now. That did not happen just by chance. People have been working on it for months, and which is quite wonderful. And so tomorrow night, may I go back to the shoe?
Yes. No, the more we go back, I am all about going back to the shoe. So yes, please.
This is a different shoe. When I first got to Connecticut,
Yeah.
one of the things very early on that Lois Watson told me about when they went in to take the belongings out of the house that was rotting, one of the things in the room, the box room where everything was stored, was a shoe. It was size 3 shoe, and it still had mud on it. And she figured it was Canadian mud, which it probably was, Canadian or Newfoundland mud. And, the shoes, it's vulnerability is what it is.
There you go.
But her size 3 shoe. And this whole discussion, my grandfather was a sea captain out of New London, Connecticut.
Yeah.
And he went down with his ship. And that's all I know. Wow. And every once in a while I think, I really ought to look into that and see what I can find. I mean, I found Edith Watson. Why can't I find him? And I haven't done it. And so now you've brought that front and center again.
If you give me the name of the ship, then I can...
I don't know.
Okay.
Yeah. So.
And Edith also went up the coast on the SS Kyle.
Yes.
Yeah, I was going to mention that because I was looking in the piece, and it says Connecticut artist sailed up the coast of Labrador on the SS Kyle in 1913, and so if we're talking history and naval history or not just ocean history here, to be on the Kyle, a lot of layers to that.
Yeah, and we know because I forget where the article was from, but there was a news article where Edith and her partner Victoria and a few other ship members basically applauded Captain Parsons and his skill of the ocean. So it's in a little newspaper. They wrote this little article up and published it and dedicated it to him.
So then when you look at for your talk tomorrow and
Friday.
Oh, sorry, Friday. Today's
evening.
Wednesday. Friday evening. So you're talking on Friday, everyone.
6:30 Friday.
So for the Friday 6:30 talk, what do you think of the further imprint that Edith S. Watson's work will have on people who see this, and what that can mean for the younger crowd that may look at this and have their own thoughts about what was and what is now and what will be?
These photographs seem to make an impression on pretty well everyone who sees them. And it was interesting last night. There were some young people there, and they were looking at various of the photographs. And they were picking up on, well, actually, one of them said, "Look at the shoes. You could walk 1,000 miles in those shoes."
Yeah.
And they weren't special shoes. They were just ordinary shoes, not walking shoes even. Anyway, you could walk 1,000 miles in those shoes. And I said, and she did. Mm-hmm. And it was kind of like, oh. And people ask questions. They say they recognize places. Sometimes they recognize people. That's a well where I took water. That's I carried water in buckets like that. That was David Quinton, actually, who carried water in buckets as a child. And, they work so hard. And sometimes somebody just says, this is just perfect. It's magic. I will carry this with me forever. And it's really interesting. It seems that there's nobody who doesn't get an impression, a significant impression from these photographs. And I love it. It's wonderful. And I get to hear from people and the first letter that I got about Working Light was from David Quinton, who organized one of the talks I did here. And then the second book came out, the Newfoundland and Labrador book came out, and I heard from Ladonia. And I have yet to hear much from people who had to do with the ships or who are directly involved with the fishing. Overwhelming number of people who were involved with fishing. And of course, after the once people could fish anymore, it's been a while, a generation. So it's really not a surprise, I suppose. But I'd be curious to hear from people who are directly involved in the fishing. And
there's something I've through the conversation today, whether it's from photos or thinking about shipwrecks, it's the and also just talking about the highway that the water has been over the years. It just reminded me of at home I've got this panel picture of St. John's Harbor from somewhere late 1900s, early 20th century, right? And it's got schooners and everything. And when I was in Nagasaki, Japan, I saw this old black and white picture of around the same time period of like the harbor for Nagasaki, and it was the same types of ships. They didn't look that different at all, and there was just like it was an imprint that it made on me of just thinking of like you don't always think about how connected the world is, and it's only through looking at what's been preserved and saved in those stories and the human stories about it that you really kind of start to realize how connected we've been and how more similar we are than dissimilar in a lot of different ways. So it's just something I don't know, just kind of came up in my mind through this. Joan, any other thoughts from? And tell us a little bit more about what else is in this issue too, if you could.
We've got some beautiful portfolios. Imagery is linked to ships from Barbie Pratt, Ned Pratt. When you're talking about the harbor, John Hartman. So two different portfolios with more than 24 artists in there. And we've got a book review of Perry Chaffe's.
Okay, excellent. Yeah.
And we have our history quiz that we usually do and our mystery photo. And the archival notes. You like that. Jenny Higgins' archival notes.
Yeah. I love anything, literally anything Jenny Higgins does. And this one, because I just didn't, tell us a bit, I'm just kind of scrolling down to find it, but it's just the treasure trove of archives that are just stored
what they can tell us is their crew lists and their agreements between the crew and their employers, and it just tells you so much of who was working when, what they were earning, where they were going. It also includes, she doesn't get into this too much there because she didn't have the space, but it includes a lot of medical information as well. And they were almost destroyed because, of course, it's a lot of paper. Where are you going to store this? There's actually something that Neil mentioned too about artifacts. It's all well, you get permission to search and you can bring stuff to the surface, but then it takes a lot of money to keep it in the state that it must be kept in, and that's another gap in the knowledge of some of these wrecks sometimes. But yeah, so how to store these things and where they were storing them. First, they were just going to keep every 5th year, which is not nothing, but it's far from everything. So it's Keith Matthews had arranged to have it brought here, and it's well used. People can delve into that and come up with a lot of different kinds of information.
And we're talking, these are logbooks from the 1860s to the 1930s with a smaller quantity from the 1950s to the 1970s. So if you're looking at, so it's, you can be diving for wrecks, and also you've got logbooks from ships, who was on them, the medical information, there's little stories of, like, one time there was someone who got left behind. So the ship goes to sail to England, and meanwhile there's someone who was supposed to be on the ship, and then he had to go on another one later because, like, you can't just, they didn't turn around and get him, right? So, like, it's like these types of stories, and to understand, like, for, like, what's being sold and, like, where ships are going, I mean, it's just a fascinating amount of history that, like you said, was almost destroyed, got brought here, and now there's, like, you're talking so many people through the run of a year who will still go and go through these documents.
And another piece there that we have was great is The Sailor's Valentines by Megan Collins. So these are beautiful objects that a sailor would bring back to his sweetheart. And they're just really pretty things, really exotic things. But they represent so much of what was thought of as from a different world. It touches on, and I don't know enough about this to really start talking about it, but the Black Atlantic, like, it's also why we have molasses and rum here, like that whole triangular trade.
Yeah, there's a slave trade, about emancipation story, looking at Barbados and then how these were made, and this would be an early example of just of essentially like souvenir buying and like the fascinating story around all of that.
Who made them, why they were bought, what they represent, and I love this because it's about everything. Like, you can just take it, every object has its own journey, and as for that broader topic, that's an issue in itself. You could do so much about that.
We're getting down there on time. Any final thoughts today, just about whether it's like lasting of the conversation or what's to come?
I just want to tease that Neil has a special wreck that he really wants to visit, and we're not going to give too much about it away, but if you just want to mention that.
There's a bunch, but one I'd really like to visit is Royal Navy submarine down on the south coast that was sunk by accident in the Second World War. And our group has found it. Wow. And we'd like to get an ROV down on it to get video so we can confirm the identity. We've been in touch with the Royal Navy, and they want to see video so they can match it up with their drawings and confirm that it is. But the whole crew was lost when it was sunk, and it included a Newfoundlander who was a seaman on the submarine, and an officer from Central Canada, and a very unfortunate Canadian Navy officer who got a ride on the sub to go from Argentia to St. John's. Wow. And he picked the wrong time to go on it.
Well, if you get to do that, let us know, because I'm interested in hearing more about it, of course.
Yeah.
Final thoughts for today? We only got about less than a minute left.
Okay. Quickly, I think when I think about ships, I really think about it being an education. I've worked on them my whole life, and that what it's brought to my life by visiting so many places in the Arctic, the Faroe Islands, Greenland, Iceland. I think it's made my life a richer life. I'm sure that was the same for Edith Watson as well.
Yeah. Frances, yourself?
Yes, Edith has certainly enhanced my life. I have a copy of Newfoundland Quarterly beside me here, and the cover, I have to mention it, is absolutely wonderful.
Well, that leads us right into what we're about to do. So that's our new subscription prize by Jean-Claude Roy, who not only gives us a painting, he says, what's the theme of your issue? In this case, it was boats. So he painted Boats, Portugal Cove. So that's our fall issue cover. That's our new subscription painting. And now we're about to draw for the previous.
Yeah, so I've got it. I just drew from a big bag of about 1,000 things. You want to say what it's for and who the lucky winner
The
is.
subscription prize will be No Straight Line, so it was on our fall issue cover last year, and
gorgeous.
Adam has drawn the name of Cheryl Perkins.
All right. So Cheryl, if you're listening, someone's going to be in touch, and congratulations on this. Thanks for this today.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you.
All right, folks, that is it for the show. So thank you, Joan Sullivan, Latonia Hardery, Frances Rooney, Neil Burgess. Folks, thank you for listening. that is our Newfoundland Quarterly fall issue. So the next time we'll be talking about the Quarterly, it will be winter. So, and it's, Joan, what's the next issue about?
Newfoundland Renaissance.
There we go. I forgot to plug that. Thank you very much. Tomorrow on the show, news broke this week about that the federal fisheries minister ignored DFO advice by reopening the commercial cod fishery and what was expected to be politically a victory, quote unquote, there. What do you think about the decision to lift the moratorium? What are your thoughts on fisheries management around the waters of Newfoundland and Labrador? Full call in tomorrow. The lines will be open. Until then, thanks for listening. Stay safe out there.